Okay, it's 10:30. So, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a very happy new year. My name is Elisha Law. I'm a researcher from Ocean and the moderator of Ocean's International Seminar. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us here today for Ocean's first seminar of year 2026. I see some familiar faces and a very warm welcome to everyone and anyone new here today. So for those who don't know, Ocean hosts weekly seminars on every Tuesday from 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. KST. The first Tuesday of the month is held in English as an international seminar, while other Tuesdays are held in Korean. Our seminars mostly focus on marine debris and plastic pollution, so we welcome anyone and everyone who's interested to join. To begin, today's seminar is actually Ocean's 568th weekly seminar and our 170th Ocean International Seminar. We have a very special guest here today from Ocean Conservancy via Zoom. Dr. Erin Murphy is the manager of ocean plastics research at Ocean Conservancy, and she is the first author of the paper which we will be listening to and discussing today, entitled A Quantitative Risk Assessment Framework for Mortality Due to Macroplastic Ingestion in Seabirds, Marine Mammals, and Sea Turtles. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Erin. Dr. Erin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you all for joining today. As Alicia said, my name is Erin Murphy, and I'll be presenting on this paper we recently published in PNAS entitled A Quantitative Risk Assessment Framework for Mortality Due to Macroplastic Ingestion in Seabirds, Marine Mammals, and Sea Turtles. And below you can see the list of my co-authors on this paper. So just to give a little bit of background, plastic ingestion has been documented now in nearly 1,300 marine species, and these are across taxa, so marine mammals, birds, sea turtles, fishes, and sessile mobile invertebrates. And we know that this plastic ingestion can cause injury, illness, and death. But an important question remains for management and kind of our ecological understanding of this issue, which is how much plastic is too much. So what concentrations in the environment that we see are going to lead to potential population declines or community shifts that we're concerned about. So our motivation for this work was to develop a suite of monitoring and management tools for macroplastic to track the problem, identify risk thresholds, and inform guidelines, goals, and regulations. And so our long-term goals through this body of work are to develop a really strong monitoring protocol for macroplastics in the environment and in biota, to develop risk assessment methodologies in a risk management framework that can also ultimately be used to set thresholds and targets for management around the globe. So I'll start by just giving a little background on what a risk assessment is. So it's just a process to identify potential hazards, and it's frequently used to understand the risks that pollution poses to things like marine wildlife. And risk assessments have two key components. The first is exposure, so what amount of contaminant is in the environment and what amount of a contaminant such as plastic are animals actually being exposed to. And the second piece is impact. So if animals are exposed to different levels of a pollutant, in this case macroplastic, what is the severity of harm that we expect them to experience? And these can be quantitative, qualitative, semi-quantitative, or scenario-based, but in general, they're just a tool that helps us better understand the risks that individuals or populations are facing. And in general, risk assessments for this impact piece will often use laboratory experiments to better understand that relationship between a dose that animals are exposed to and the severity of harm. But one of the challenges with macroplastics is that it's unethical and infeasible to test this impact in laboratory experiments. So we can't expose large marine mammals or sea turtles, which are often endangered species, to macroplastics and measure impact in this way. And so we have to be a bit creative in how we understand the risk that macroplastic ingestion poses to these species. So the goals of this research in particular was to quantify the relationship between plastic in the gut and chance of death in these animals. And so on the right, you can see an example model output that we are aiming for. And so on the x-axis, you would have some amount of plastic that's found in these animals. We looked at pieces and volume in the gastrointestinal tract. And then on the y-axis, you see the chance of death that we would anticipate from plastic ingestion. And we focused on acute mortality events. So these were instances where plastics punctured the GI tract, actually perforating it and leading to necrosis or other infections, and then obstruction of the GI tract. So plastic is actually blocking the movement of food through the animals. And the reason we focused on this is because it's a bit easier to identify death from plastic ingestion with these acute mortality events. It's harder using by-caught or dead animals that are stranded to measure other types of harm from plastic ingestion. And we focused on seabirds, marine mammals, and sea turtles, and this was largely due to data availability. There was a lot less data on fishes and invertebrates in terms of when plastic ingestion actually led to harm. And we also wanted to explore the lethality of different plastic types. And so we looked at hard plastics, soft plastics, rubber, and fishing debris independently as well, because we know that different plastics move through the GI tract differently and are more or less likely to cause different levels of harm. And finally, we collected a lot of data to inform these models, and so we wanted to summarize research on ocean macroplastic ingestion and ingestion mortality. So our approach to do this was to first build a global database of plastic ingestion events and mortality events from plastic ingestion. And so we reviewed macroplastic ingestion literature, and we extracted necropsy data. We then used this database to develop a risk assessment tool and a model that could be applied to any sort of taxa or animal and any sort of plastic type, and we piloted it on the 3 taxa of interest. And so the outputs of this first body of work were global thresholds for our 3 taxa, and then a risk assessment tool that could be applied in the future to fishes or other animals, or focus on specific regions if data is available. For the literature review, to collect data to inform these models, we searched the literature from 1900 to 2023, and our search terms included ingestion and then different names for plastic. So plastic debris, marine debris, macro and mesoplastics, and fisheries debris. And most of the literature we ultimately pulled was from the peer-reviewed literature, although we also had 2 stranding network databases as well. And for inclusion in our analysis, the paper had to be on our 3 taxa of interest. It also had to have data specifically on macroplastic ingestion. So we focused on these larger pieces. And the reason for this was really because microplastic risk assessments are already being developed. And so we wanted these to be complementary to risk assessments that are already being developed for plastic without being redundant. We needed cause of mortality to be reported. And so we needed to know if an animal died from plastic ingestion or from another cause of death. And finally, we needed high-resolution data on ingested plastic. And this was actually pretty limiting for inclusion of literature, because a lot of papers would report mean ingestion rates or sort of general data, but they didn't report individual level data on the plastic ingested. And that's really important for understanding risk. So from these studies, we had to collect organismal data, so we collected family and species data, a lot of biological characteristics such as sex, body length, and sexual maturity. And we also collected information on how the sample was collected. So where was it collected, what year, and what was the collection method? Was it by-caught? Was it a stranded individual? Was it cold? And finally, the cause of death for that individual. And we also collected a lot of plastics data. So all of the types of plastic that the animal had consumed, and for each plastic type, we recorded the number of pieces of plastic ingestion and also the volume of plastic ingested. And volume sometimes wasn't reported, so when it wasn't, we would estimate volume when possible. This was either using the mass and the density of the material, or using dimensions, which were often reported length, width, and height of items. And finally, in some instances, we used photos when they were available. And then we reported if plastic was the cause of death, the plastic type that led to mortality. So did an animal, for instance, we saw an albatross that died from eating a plastic water bottle. That was reported specifically as the item that caused death. So here's a summary of our necropsy data, and this is publicly available, so it's available in the SI of the paper. We're also going to be sharing it. Ocean Conservancy is going to be sharing it in the future on our website, so anybody can use this data, and hopefully it's helpful. But we had more than 10,000 individuals in our database, over 1,500 seabirds, and here you can see roughly a third of the seabirds in our database had ingested plastic, and of those that did, 5% died from plastic ingestion. For marine mammals, we had over 7,000 individuals, 12% of those had ingested plastic, and 5% died from plastic ingestion. And for sea turtles, we had 1,300 individuals, and roughly half of them ingested plastic. And of those that did, 9% died from plastic ingestion. So nearly 1 in 20 sea turtles in our database died from plastic ingestion, which was pretty significant. And I will note that these percentages are influenced by the sampling methods and locations. And so depending on where these studies occurred, we saw significant differences in how often plastic ingestion was the cause of death. So then we use this data to develop a series of mortality models, and I'll just go through the general ones here first. So for seabirds, marine mammals, and sea turtles, we first looked at just total plastic pieces in their gut and the chance that they would die from plastic ingestion. And for seabirds, the 50% threshold, which is the first dotted line, was 11%, and 23 pieces was associated with a 90% chance of mortality. For marine mammals, the 50 and 90% mortality thresholds were 12 pieces and 29 pieces. And for sea turtles, they were a little over 100 pieces and roughly 400 pieces. And I think it's important to note here that the average piece size varied a lot by animal group, and I think that helps put these numbers in context. So for seabirds, we saw that they were eating pretty small pieces of plastic. On average, they're smaller than the size of a Tic Tac. For marine mammals, the average piece size was about the size of a tennis ball. And for sea turtles, they were also very small, like the size of a pea. So it's possible with these sea turtles that they're biting off pieces and they're eating smaller pieces of plastic, so these piece thresholds are higher, but the amount of plastic in their gut might be slightly lower than for the mammals, for instance, who are eating larger pieces of plastic. Next, we looked at the relationship between plastic volume that was consumed and the chance of death. And here we related volume to an animal's size or body length. And the reason we did that is because, as you can imagine, the volume of plastics that's going to lead to death in a sea otter and a blue whale is going to be very different. But it's largely related to the size of that GI tract, and body length is a very good predictor of gut size. And so we used this so that we could normalize the volume that was eaten by the size of an animal and understand the risk of a specific value based on the animal size. And so I'm going to go to the next slide just to kind of help conceptualize some of these. So first I'll point out here. So we have seabirds. We also looked at different plastic types for each animal. So for seabirds, we looked at total plastics, hard plastic pieces, and rubber. And you can see rubber in particular was very dangerous for seabirds. So just 6 pieces of plastic of rubber, like balloons, led to a 90% chance of death for seabirds. And half the volume of rubber led to a 90% chance of death compared to plastics generally. For marine mammals, soft plastics, particularly by volume, were very dangerous, with roughly a tenth the volume per body length being deadly for marine mammals. And for sea turtles, we saw hard and soft plastics were more deadly than plastics generally. And so now, to better understand how that volume threshold, what that looks like when we consider different sized animals, I'm going to share 3 examples, one from each taxa. And so here we're looking at an Atlantic puffin, which have an adult average body length of about 28 centimeters. And so using those volume to body length thresholds, we can see that about 9 out of 10 will die from eating just 2.8 centimeters cubed of plastic. So this is less than 3 sugar cubes of plastic in size. When we look at rubber, it was 1.2 centimeters cubed of rubber, or of a balloon, for example, would lead to a 90% chance of death. And this is just about 1 sugar cube in size. So very small amounts of plastics can lead to death in seabirds. For harbor porpoises, which have a mean body length of 150 centimeters or 59 inches, 9 out of 10 will die from eating about 6,000 centimeters of plastic, which is about a soccer ball in size. And when we look at soft plastics, again, this threshold's much lower, almost a tenth, as I said. And so these would be like plastic bags or sheets of plastic. And here, just about 3 baseballs in size would lead to a 90% chance of death. And for fishing debris, which would be like fishing line, 13 meters was associated with a 90% chance of mortality. And finally, for a loggerhead turtle, if it has a body length of 90 centimeters, 9 out of 10 will die from 497 centimeters cubed of plastic, which is about 2 1/4 baseballs. And when we look at hard plastics, 288 centimeters cubed of hard plastics, which would be like a bottle cap, was associated with a 90% chance of mortality. And this is about 1.3 baseballs in size. And for the sea turtles in general, they have such a big range in size through their life stages. So as you can imagine, these thresholds in small sea turtles like post-hatchlings are quite low when we're thinking about turtles that are maybe under 10 centimeters in curved carapace length. And so we did see really high mortality rates for small sea turtles in our database as well. And our models kind of support this high level of risk for those small individuals. And these volume thresholds then can be applied to any species around the world. And this is really one of the strengths of these models. We know that there's a lot of species we can't study the risk that plastic ingestion poses to them. We don't see them very often. We had very few individuals from some species, or 0 individuals from some species in our 10,000 animal database. But using this volume to size ratio, we can kind of predict the amount of plastic that would lead to mortality in these individuals. And so here you can see, I'll let you look at it for a second, but a suite of different animals, all of the sea turtles are on here, and the amount of plastics generally that we would expect to lead to a 90% chance of mortality. And again, if we're talking about some of these particularly dangerous plastics, like soft plastics for marine mammals or rubber for birds, these thresholds are even lower. And so what I think what I want people to take away from this work is that small amounts of plastic can be lethal to ocean animals. And this is really concerning. Some of these thresholds were a lot smaller than we anticipated, especially for the seabirds. And lethality varies by plastic type, taxa, and animal size. And so, this is important for informing policy. There are material types that we may want to prioritize if we're trying to protect marine wildlife, like rubber or balloons, which also seem to be preferentially consumed by seabirds when they are in the environment. And there's a few key things our research can't tell us that I just want to remind you. So it doesn't tell us the amount of plastic an animal is exposed to or the amount of plastic an animal will eat. So if an animal has a really small impact or small chance of a small threshold for chance of mortality, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're likely to eat that amount. It really depends on where they are in the environment and how much plastic they're surrounded by. And this is what we're focusing on in the next steps in this body of work. And the other thing it doesn't tell us is the total impact of plastic. So there's a lot of key harms from plastic pollution that are missing from these estimates, which are chronic effects of plastic ingestion or the chemical impacts of plastic ingestion, and also entanglement. We know that entanglement for some of these species may be even more deadly than ingestion, and so this is by itself an underestimate of the total risk that plastic pollution is going to pose to marine wildlife. Thank you so much for your time. I'm excited to answer any of your questions about this work.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Can we please give a round of applause for Dr. Erin? We now welcome comments and questions from the floor. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand in the Zoom or just wave at the camera. Yep, Dr. Carl?
Aloha. So I was very interested in the fact that you had rubber as one of the categories there, and was wondering, was that only balloons that you considered rubber? What else is rubber in the guts?
Yeah, we saw it was mostly balloons. I think there was only one instance that we found that wasn't balloons, and it was like hard to identify what it was. It was a piece of rubber and something else. Some in a seabird, but largely it was balloons. And the rate of death that we saw in the database was really high. So about 40% of individuals that ate any piece of balloon died from that, and it was largely obstruction, so it'd get stuck in the junctures in the GI tract, and because it's stretchy like that, it just didn't move through very easily, and so that's kind of mechanistically why we think they're particularly dangerous, but that was often where it was like in a juncture in the GI tract.
Yeah, that seems to be the big problem, going from one juncture to the other. And
Yep.
we found that in the sperm whale that washed up on Kauai. And in that case, it was the eel traps, cones that were just packed in there. But there's also the sheet plastic
Yep.
that is like your rubber, but it's not elastic. And,
Yeah.
and that could be the difference. I think general sheet, whether it's rubber or plastic, sheets of things can mold themselves to obstruct areas.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
we saw a lot
that's
of
where,
plastic sheets as well.
yeah, and that's where the problem of measuring the volume is difficult, because a big piece of sheet plastic could cover a whole opening, but it has very little volume because it's so thin.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the other thing about the rubber is, I'm wondering, do you have any ideas about the toxicity of what was eaten? We see, for example, with the albatross, we see all the lighters and things like that are probably highly toxic, what's in them. And rubber could be also toxic. It's not natural rubber, it's some sort of latex of some sort, which is a petrochemical problem.
Yeah, with lots of like different plasticizers and additives in it. Yeah, we didn't look at that mainly just because we didn't have that data, but as we build out this risk assessment work, it's definitely something that we're interested in. And we're still kind of figuring out what the best way to integrate that is, but that's why I definitely like cautioning at the end that this is an underestimate, because it's only these acute mortality events because they were easier to identify through necropsy and more often reported. But I think also some of the work that's being done with microplastics can be really informative for understanding some of the risk of chemical impacts or chronic exposure to specific chemical types or plastic types, versus here it's really like the physical impacts of obstruction. But are you familiar with Tomex?
Yeah. Yes. The problem there is we have no idea of the retention time and how much leach of the plasticizers and things leaches out. So you have the chronic exposure of stuff that's in the gut for a long period of time. But if there isn't the impact, then the stuff may move through very quickly. And this would indicate that it's the process of packing all together and obstructing the passage is the most important thing leading to death, as opposed to any chemical leaching out of these things. And that's what's coming. As you said, we can't do experiments with marine mammals and things, so we're looking at copepods and little fish and things like that for the rate of passage and chemical uptake. Cool. Great, thank you.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat box. Chong, would you like to read it yourself, or should I read it for you? Okay. So I'll read it. So the question from Chong is, do you have a risk assessment for each group of species because their food and foraging habit is different, so the risk they might be exposed to is different? If no, it could be good if you created a risk score table for each species.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So in this body of work, we didn't look at kind of the different exposure based on species. Once it's in, the assumption we made is like once it's in the gut, these guts generally have similar structures within these taxa, and the mechanisms of blockage are the same, but they're definitely going to eat different amounts of plastic based on how they forage and where they live and the concentrations in their environment. So I actually previously, during my PhD, developed a qualitative risk assessment framework that kind of did what you're talking about, using a trait-based approach. So looking at different traits that are going to influence risk overall, including how likely they are to ingest plastic or be entangled in plastics, and basically did that, looking at creating a risk score. And it was actually focused on species in Hawaiian waters, but looking at sea turtles, marine mammals, and seabirds, again, because of data availability, and giving them scores based on their traits. Down the line, like the next body of work that we're working on right now is to quantify the risk there. And so we're working on a risk assessment framework that brings some of the exposure work that's been done to this impact work. And there, I think we'll really start getting at your question in a more quantitative way. How do these other traits influence it? And again, concentrations in the environment, but it's challenging to do that well, especially with these net crop seed individuals, because the locations that we find them might not be the locations where they were most recently feeding. So there's a lot to consider there, but I think that's where we need to go.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Pushit. Pushit wonders if, after some time that we polluted our sea and oceans, are the marine mammals and seabirds learning or evolving on how to avoid ingestion of plastic pollution?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know. What I will say is you definitely, especially with the sea turtles, you seem to see certain individuals who eat just a lot. Like, you might have a study with 100 individuals, and half of them, for our sea turtles, for instance, didn't eat any plastic, and most of the ones who did had fewer amounts. And then you see these individuals that seem to eat really large amounts, and so there does seem to be some behavior, like individual behavior at play that might be influencing that. But I don't know that, we'll know, it'd be a long time scale to know if this is leading to like behavioral change for certain species. I'm not sure, but there's definitely seems to be individual variation within species in terms of how much they're eating. That's pretty significant. And there's some interesting research. It's not what I focus on, but looking at, what are the mechanisms that are causing certain species or certain individuals to ingest plastic. So olfactory or visual cues that might be making plastics look like food sources for particular species or individuals or, populations in certain areas. And so that could definitely influence how likely they are to eat plastics or to avoid it.
Mm-hmm. Trang, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Erin, for a very interesting paper. I and Kuang just finished the research on the plastic impact to biodiversity in Vietnam, and we also think a lot to how to have a next study related to monitoring. You also mentioned that on your motivation for study is to develop a monitoring tool and protocol. So how is it going currently now? If anything to share, suggestion for college information in Vietnam, because when we did the study, for the macro plastic is the currently now not much in Vietnam for the paper related to the rich threshold, so we use quite international for Vietnam currently now.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would be happy to talk to you more about that separately. I think, data harmonization is going to be really important, and going through the literature, there's definitely a need for that. We just submitted a paper on monitoring protocols in biota and how reporting so there's a lot of reporting protocols that already exist that are very good for plastic ingestion, but they don't necessarily have the same goals. So a lot of it is biomonitoring, and we worked on kind of adding to some of those existing biomonitoring protocols that are well used to indicate what people could include to then help inform risk assessment specifically. And so that's in review right now, but I'd be happy to talk to you about that and kind of the add-ons to the existing protocols that people already have that we think could allow data collection to keep informing the biomonitoring piece. We definitely don't want to redirect or direct away from that, but kind of also inform these sorts of risk assessment protocols.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, comments from the floor?
Here I am. Thank you for a wonderful presentation for you. And I have a question about the supplementary information. In the supplementary table 2, it says final ingestion data and NMDS. Here, there are many items, debris items, and you included hard plastic and soft plastic and rubber and the fishing debris. Then it means you aggregated data and categorized into the hard plastic, soft plastic, rubber, and fishing debris, right?
Yeah.
Is the first question. And you omit other debris like or maybe you. My question is, do you include cloth and foam into the hard plastic or soft plastic, or you omit? That is my
that's a good question. So we included those in the total plastic counts. We included anything that was characterized as plastic by the researchers in that total plastic count. And then they were already categorized into those groups. So a lot of studies had specifically categorized things themselves as hard, soft, rubber, line, etc. So we either used their categories or we aggregated it if it was at a higher resolution, like some studies said 8 plastic bags and 3 nets, for example. So for those 4 categories that we modeled, the hard, soft, rubber, and fishing debris, we modeled those because there was enough data to model those for the taxa that we modeled them for. So there wasn't enough data on rubber ingestion in marine mammals, for example, or foam or cloth ingestion in marine mammals to develop material-specific models for those plastic types. But we kept them separate and we didn't aggregate them. So like cloth is still separate from the other plastic types, but it's in the total. However, again, this is something, if we had more data, we could definitely do it. So if more data is created that has information on rubber ingestion in marine mammals or soft plastic ingestion in birds, then those models could be produced. We just didn't have the data in this data set to do so.
Thank you. And other questions in the data, we have, for example, foam and the foam volume and other volume like that. And the foam, no underlying explanation means pieces, number of pieces.
Yeah, there's number of pieces and volume for foam. So there's final ingestion. Are you looking at the final ingestion data or the NMDS data?
Final ingestion data.
Yeah, so foam is the pieces and foam volume is the volume. And there's just not a lot that we found in there. Again, that were macroplastics. So in some of these individuals, they reported macro and microplastics, and we excluded microplastics from this just because we wanted to make sure to focus on macroplastic risk.
And other question for the Excel data, nodal and pellet. We have nodal and pellet here. And what's difference nodal from pellet?
Where do you see pellet?
Maybe pellet is original material for plastic, and nodal is round thing, maybe?
Oh yeah, so that was they're the same. I use them interchangeably. So the first part, nurdles were then included when they were reported as nurdles as hard plastics. Very few studies reported if there were nurdles or not. And in the second piece there, I included the three largest, or like the individual volumes of three different items. So if there was like 3 pellets in an individual, you can there see the individual volume of each of those. So those are just looking at like pellet 1, pellet 2, pellet 3, in their individual volume basically. And then the sum of the volumes is what's reported where it says nurdle volume. And that was just to get an, kind of when I was looking at the data, I was interested in if it mattered if it was like one really large piece or, you know, a bunch of medium-sized pieces, or what was driving the relationship kind of between volume ingestion and likelihood of death. But total volume was kind of mattered more than like the biggest piece you ate.
Thank you. Final question. I'm sorry, I have many questions. And you mentioned in the text, your data over-represent the mortality of, as far as my understanding, you says your data over-represent the mortality of the animal from the plastic. My opinion is it may underestimate because we don't find many cases animals are dead from plastic ingestion as well as plastic entanglement, because these studies like what can I say, bycatch or we just can gather data when we found a dead body like that, but in the open ocean, many animals may die from the plastic ingestion, but we cannot find. So this kind of study may underestimate the mortality or risk from the plastic ingestion and entanglement.
Yeah,
how do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think entanglement, I think that's absolutely true, especially because you're talking about a lot of ghost gear that's on the ocean floor, and a lot of those interactions are animals that are like diving down, becoming entangled, and especially for these attacks of drowning. I've heard it both ways in terms of the ingestion risk, and honestly, I think it's hard to say. So what other researchers have talked to me about is basically it's the proportion, right? Not the total number. And when you see stranding events, you get really high proportions of dead animals from plastics compared to other data sets. And looking at like some of the stranding network databases, or like the marine mammal or marine manatee database, for instance, we saw like much fewer plastic deaths than in places that were just collecting stranded individuals. So the question is really like proportionally, if we're using a bunch of stranded individuals, are those more likely to have been plastic deaths than proportionally the amount of animals that die in the open ocean. And I think, because the coastal zone has more plastic interactions, it's possible that like proportion is shifted. But I'm not going to claim that I'm certain of the directionality of that. But I think that, the important thing is just acknowledging that there's a limitation of using necrot seed individuals, which is that we're making the assumption in our models that dead individuals represent the live populations. And I feel pretty good about that assumption in this work because we did use a lot of bicaught individuals, answered individuals, and cold. We had animals collected from all over the world that were found or collected in different ways, but that is definitely an assumption that needs acknowledging because all of these animals are dead. They're just dead from different causes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
thanks for those
Dr.
questions.
Lee. Are there any other questions from the floor? Okay, now we have Dr. Hong.
Hi, Dr. Murphy. I'm Sunny from OSEAN. First of all, I really appreciate your hard work and you and your team's hard work to integrate all the existing data on plastic ingestion. It was really, really great job. And I have two questions. One is about the data reporting. You integrated all the data about the size. So I guess many publications reported the size of microplastic in length rather than cubic centimeters. So how did you integrate all data how did you transform all the data form to cubic centimeters? That is my first question. And the second is you mentioned in your paper, it's about some guidance for coastal cleanup activities using this kind of data result. So would you add more things about cleanup activities for further engagement, such as protecting marine animals? That's it. Thank you.
Yeah. So for the first question, there's a supplementary figure that shows all the different ways we converted to volume, and it really depended on the study, and we only did it if we felt good about it. So a lot of studies reported mass in a material type, and we used density and mass then to estimate volume. And then a lot of the studies we included reported length, width, and height, so 3 dimensions of volume. In those cases, we used that. For some, there was photos with a scale. And so in those instances, we measured the pixels of it. And then if we knew the item, such as a plastic bag, we used, the average thickness of a plastic bag and the dimensions from the photo to estimate volume. If they gave a shape, or if it was something like monofilament line, we used a typical thickness and then the length that they reported. If it was, sometimes they provided a specific product that they found. Then we looked up the product. So sometimes it was a 12-ounce Coke bottle or a specific fishing lure. In those instances, went online and looked at the dimensions of those items online and estimated the volume. So it depended on the study and what was in there. And it was, to be honest, a pain because I did that for all of the studies. And then for some of the individuals where they had really good pieces data, but they didn't have volume data, we included them to inform the pieces model, but not the volume model. So that also sometimes was the case if we had, the good pieces data. And honestly, I think that volume is more informative than pieces, especially if you think about turtles, which maybe are eating one item, but they're biting it, and so they're chewing, kind of breaking it up as they eat it. And so it's a lot of pieces, but they're really small pieces, and it was one item. But there's just so much more data available on pieces that we thought it was good to include that because the models are they're more robust. Again, with more volume data being reported, I think that could be more useful. And then for the second question about cleanups, I think, so Ocean Conservancy has been running the International Coastal Cleanup for 40 years. That's something that we feel is really important, and it's been really exciting in the last few years in particular to see how our data has been used to showcase the value of particular interventions. So there's a recent study that showed that plastic bag bans in the US are reducing the relative abundance of plastic bags in beach cleanups by 25 to 47%, which is really significant. And so I think, to me, the thing about things like coastal cleanups and beach cleanups is you can really target problematic materials. A lot of the problematic materials are more likely to be in the coastal zone, like plastic bags and balloons and fishing debris as well. And so, these are especially in areas like Hawaii, for instance, where Carl is, that there is a lot of, fishing debris coming to shore. We can really, first and foremost, use these cleanup events to remove debris from the animal's environment, to target particularly dangerous materials that are more likely to be in coastal zones, and then finally for monitoring and kind of monitoring what's there now and the outcomes of different interventions that we implement. So is the balloon ban or the bag ban that we implemented to target specific, high-risk materials working? Are we seeing a reduction? And that's where that citizen science component of cleanups is actually very important.
Thank you. Thank you for the question and comments, Dr. Hong. I think we can get one more question from the floor. Seems like there are no questions. Final call. Okay, so there's no questions, and I think we can wrap up today's seminar. So thank you once again, Dr. Erin, for joining us today. Let's all give her one final round of applause.
Thank you all.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. Today's seminar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel probably in a day or two. So if anyone wants to share to anyone else, we welcome you to join our to find and visit our YouTube channel at OceanKR. For our next seminar will be on February 3rd, probably presented by myself or another colleague. So please have a look out for our seminar notifications. Thank you, everyone, and have a blessed new year. Thank you. Bye-bye.